Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Baum, and today we're going to talk about how Congress is responding to the Air Force and Space Force budget submissions. As you all know, the administration submits a budget request, but the actual dollars that the services will receive are determined by Congress, and that is largely driven by the defense committees in the House and the Senate. Now, some government 101 here, and I apologize if you already know this, but there are two types of defense committees that have primary jurisdiction over the Department of Defense in each chamber, the authorizers and the appropriators. Now, the authorizers give the services permission to spend specific allotments of money, as well as handling a range of policy provisions, and the appropriators actually provide the dollars. Now, all of this gives me a headache. So the way I keep it straight in my mind is I think of a story that my friend told me. He said, when his child comes to him and says, hey, mom said I'm allowed to go to the mall. And then child looks at them with a blank stare and said, oh, they obviously need money. Well, they've been authorized to go to the mall, but they haven't been appropriated to buy anything. So this is where we have Congress being all about checks and balances. So you're seeing responsibility shared across committees to ensure power isn't over-consolidated in any one given area. So to understand the players, you've got the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee for authorization in each chamber, and they have subcommittees focused on various aspects of the department, largely domain and mission specific. And when it comes to appropriations, there is one overarching committee on the appropriations in each chamber, and each of these has a subcommittee focused on defense. There are no further subcommittees that parse various service roles and missions like we see with the authorizers. Now, defense leaders testify before each of these bodies throughout the year, but especially during the budget process. Okay, so enough of the wiring diagram, but I want to ensure that you understood the basics. For the purpose of this episode, we're going to focus on the authorizers. Acting Secretary of the Air Force, John Roth, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown, and Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, have spent a fair amount of time over the past month testifying before these committees. And just as a heads up, we'll look into what the appropriators are saying during the next Rendezvous episode. There's a lot to cover this time of year. Before we kick it off with our panel, I also wanted to point out that before Matt Donovan served as the Undersecretary of the Air Force, he was on the staff for the Senate Armed Services Committee. So we've got some very unique insight and perspective on the Mitchell team when it comes to understanding all of this. So joining us today are Mitchell Dean, Lieutenant General retired Dave Deptula.
Hey, Slick, great to be here.
Sir, thanks for being here. And we also have the Director of Mitchell Institute Space Power Advantage Research Center, Matt Donovan.
Hey, Slick, great to be here.
We also have Director of Future Concepts and Capability Assessments, Mark Gunzinger.
Hi, Slick.
Senior Resident Fellow Heather Penny.
Hey, Slick, how you doing?
Doing great. Thank you all for being here. Really looking forward. So let's just hop right in. Congressman Bacon hit upon a key priority focus area of ours here at Mitchell, the pass-through. And just to remind people that is roughly 20% of the Department of the Air Force budget that the Air Force and the Space Force don't actually control.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note for my colleagues that the FY22 budget request states that the top line request for the Department of Air Force is $212 billion. What DoD's budget does not reveal is that $39 billion of that, of the Air Force top line, 18%, in fact, is not actually controlled by the Department of the Air Force, which means it neither implements nor advances the force design and operational readiness needs of our air and space forces. So when you subtract that non-blue amount from the Air Force top line, the actual top line is closer to $173 billion. So I submit that this is a Cold War era pass-through budgeting practice, and I think it distorts the public's understanding of our defense investments in air, land, sea, and space. I would guess that most members of the committee aren't even aware of this budgeting practice. I just think it's wrong. Now more than at any time in our history, every defense dollar must deliver maximum deterrent value. And for this reason, we need to have absolute clarity and transparency. So last year, this committee and our colleagues in the Senate both raised this pass-through budgeting process as a concern. And we tasked the Department of Defense to find a better way. So the Department of Defense still owes the committee an answer on how to clean this up. And we're still waiting to hear how they plan to do it.
With that, I'd like to ask who wants to respond to this one first, and how do you think the Air Force leadership did answering the question, and how would you have handled it if you were in the hot seat?
Okay, Slick, let me jump in here. It's General Deptula. First, this is, as you said at the beginning, sort of not sort of, but it is the Air Force's or should be number one priority. This is the single greatest issue or threat to spending and allocation of funds for the Department of the Air Force. Because just like Congressman Bacon said, there's essentially a misunderstanding over how much money the Air Force is actually getting. Why does this make a difference? Because in every comparison among the services, given the current budget, it appears that the Air Force is the number one funded service, when in fact it is the department that is funded the least relative to the Department of the Navy and the Army. I was talking to Senator Kramer actually this morning, and part of the challenge here is that budget people, particularly inside the Air Force, are under the perception that, most people understand that almost 20% of the Air Force budget is passed through. Well, the fact of the matter is, as Senator Kramer told me, even if you look at the Senate appropriators who are on the Defense Subcommittee, only a handful of them understand that, much less the rest of the committee, much less the rest of the Congress. And having been in the Air Force for 34 years, I can attest to the fact that most of the senior officers in the Air Force don't even understand this. So this is an enormous threat. It's the perception of how much money the Department of the Air Force gets, and it needs to be removed because the Air Force has no control of approximately 20% of their budget.
And let me jump in here, Slick. It's Matt. This is an issue that I worked when I was on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then after I moved over to the department as the Undersecretary of the Air Force. This is a practice that's gone on for decades now. A significant portion of the Department of the Air Force's budget is appropriated as that pass-through, as Dave was saying. And in some past years, the pass-through amount was as high as 23% of the Air Force's total budget. So in my mind, the most transparent remedy to this issue is to move all military service pass-throughs to the defense-wide budget lines. That way, the pass-through funding would still be accounted for in the total DoD budget, but would finally enable a clear and accurate view of the true funding each military service receives, leveling the playing field for the most important national debates on maximizing American military capabilities.
Yeah, sir, that absolutely seems to make perfect sense to me from the outsider looking in. One of the next things that I want to ask this panel is, one of the key questions that we've talked about on the podcast is the need to ensure that the Space Force receives sufficient funding and that the 60 various government entities with national security space responsibilities all streamline underneath the new service. And it turns out that Senate Armed Service Committee Chairman Jack Reed also has similar concerns.
One of the primary reasons Congress established the Space Force was to consolidate the numerous space activities in the Department of Defense. General Raymond, this is your first posture hearing, but you are a familiar face to this committee. I would like to know how you are growing the Space Force and normalizing operations within the larger Department of Defense, including progress on the merging of the Space Development Agency into the Space Force by October 1st, 2022. With regard to space warfighting capabilities, I will also want to know how you are progressing in your role as the lead force design architect for the Defense Department's satellite constellations.
Well, Slick, let me jump in here again. It's Matt. I think Joe Raymond has had a great opportunity to discuss who should be the DoD chief space architect. The format in the hearing got a little bit screwed up as Senator Reed got a little bit ahead of himself, so he didn't have quite a great opportunity to do that. But I think he's exactly right. That was the reason the Space Force was stood up, was to consolidate all these things. And I think one of the ways that could do that is that the DoD chief space architect, for the enterprise architecture, should be designated as the Secretary of the Air Force and then executed through the Chief of Space Operations and also the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration, which is the new position in the Air Force that Congress specified but has not been filled yet. So there are great opportunities to consolidate all these various and disparate efforts for space within just the Department of Defense by moving forward with this in that way.
Sir, if I can jump in there too, I think this is another example of how we're seeing the pass-through have deleterious effects. I mean, it's really breaking both the Air Force and the Space Force. If you take a look at the Space Force's budget this year, their request is for $17.4 billion. If you compare that to, the Navy and the Marine Corps got $47.9 billion. So we're seeing how that pass-through really impacts both the Air Force. That pass-through is forcing the Air Force to basically cannibalize their own capabilities and is preventing the Space Force from being able to grow in the way that it needs.
Yeah, I'd also reiterate the fact, Heather, that you just made, that the pass-through is over twice the size of the Space Force budget. Now, one of the things that Jay Raymond ought to be complimented for is his articulation of the value of the capabilities that the Space Force provides to the nation for just about 2.4% of the Department of Defense budget. And he does a very, very good job of that. But we have to also go back to the macro level and understand that one of the reasons the Space Force was put together was because it needs more investment, it needs more people, and it needs greater consolidation. And those three areas are still ones that we have to pursue.
Well, sir, sticking with space, Senator Tillis focused on the notions of identification and attribution of hostile adversary actions on orbit.
General Raymond, I think at one point, I know we've talked about in the space domain the need for identification and attribution of activities of our adversaries. I think at one point you also mentioned the concept of the need to punch back or retribution. You've got 2.4% of the total DoD budget. Number one, is retribution a part of your planning process? And number two, how do you manage with that with a relatively small percentage of the overall budget?
Well, I'll jump in here again, Slick, on space. It's not just Senator Tillis that's asking these questions. And if you want to take identification, attribution, and retribution, then what we're really talking about is identifying the threat and then defense and offense. And some of other members have asked in other hearings as well, too, about this. When the Space Force was created as the 6th Armed Service of the U.S. military, their responsibility shifted from being an enabler to being a full-fledged component for the joint warfighter. So, members are asking, what is the Space Force doing in order to become that full-fledged armed service? And I think it's important, and we're going to be hearing more about this. And then, as Heather said previously, and what Dave said as well, too, is that General Raymond does a great job talking about, look at all that we can do for just 2.4% of the DoD budget. What we're saying, from Mitchell's perspective and from my Spark perspective is you only have 2.4% of the DoD budget. Is this an important priority mission or not?
And you need more. You need more if you're going to build an offensive and defensive capability in space that sets the Chinese back on their hind legs and is so convincing that it deters any of their actions which they are capable of accomplishing today. And so that is going to be a challenge for the new Space Force, because here's the deal. General Raymond and his staff are doing a magnificent job of establishing this new service. I mean, that's huge in terms of an organizational challenge in the first place. But they're also going to have to accelerate the call for increased funding, as well as consolidation of capabilities. And guess what? That is, this is a zero-sum game, folks. So when he goes into the tank, he understands that there are other services they're going to have to give at the table. And that makes this all the greater challenge. But this is where we can also use the Congress's help in the recognition that we just stood up a new force, and they need the resources and the capabilities to move out.
And I would just add one of the ways that a chief of the service can do that is through his unfunded priorities list, which gives his best military advice to the Congress, to the chairman of the Authorization and Appropriations Committees. And I believe his unfunded priorities list this year was like about $800 million or so. I think they wouldn't have been surprised if his unfunded priority list was $5 billion in order to build the force the way he needs to go on that.
Yeah, Gonzo here. The fact of the matter is that space situational awareness is a tough problem. It's a growing problem, and that's eating up budget. And the fact of the matter is it's going to need to grow significantly. The budget is going to need to grow if they're going to do that mission. And right now, that mission is pretty much unfunded.
And to add on to that, Gonzo, we're also looking at transitioning other capabilities that the Air Force has traditionally done in an airborne environment to space. So, for example, we're moving GMTI from JSTARS up into space. So we're asking the Space Force to take on all these additional capabilities. We're just not funding them properly.
All right, well, let's switch gears here because we focused a ton of time on talking about the geriatric age and small size of the current U.S. Air Force aircraft inventory. And this is also something Senator Inhofe, who is the ranking member on the SASC, he also highlighted this. So let's take a listen.
Now, in previous administrations, and I'm talking about Barrett, Wilson, Goldfein, the Air Force leadership, they had told us that the Department of the Air Force is too small, too old to do what the nation asked to have done. Almost half of our aircraft fleet is beyond its service life. Our satellite programs were built for peacetime. Now, that was all from the previous administration. Just this last week, we had General Milley, who said that China and Russia combined are already spending more to modernize their force than we do, and it shows China will have more stealth fighters than we will in the Western Pacific by 2025. So we're getting reports now that don't look good at all. All the independent studies show that the Air Force needs to grow and modernize. This budget doesn't do either one. Procurement actually decreases by almost 15%. We keep divesting, but we don't turn around and follow with investments. Nearly all of these bad choices were caused by a budget that cuts the defense instead of the achieved 3 to 5%. We've been talking about now since 2018. It just doesn't do that.
All right, well, going around the room here, what are your thoughts on this one, and how did General Brown handle this theme, and how are the other senators addressing this issue?
Yeah, let me jump in here, as this is one. I've been talking about a geriatric Air Force for over 20 years now. Let me just highlight the fact that the good senator is spot on when he says, quote, the Air Force needs to grow and modernize, and that this budget doesn't do either one. This is a significant challenge. The reason that we've got ourselves in the situation that we have is most people do not recognize what is required to meet the needs of the National Defense Strategy. And that's why the Congress asked the Air Force, what do they need to accomplish the National Defense Strategy? And the answer the Air Force came back to them with was 386 operational squadrons, which, by the way, includes both Air Forces and Space Forces. Today, we only have 315. That's a 24% deficit. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's reality. And so it underlies the fact that we're not going to be able to meet our national defense strategy unless we can see 3 to 5% real growth that folks have been talking about since 2018. So you can either fund the services to meet the needs of the national defense strategy or change the national defense strategy, but you can't have them both the way they are. And we need the leaders to inform the public what is actually required.
Well, actually, you're talking more like 18 to 20% real growth, right? Because you need to take out that pass-through to be able to allow the Air Force and the Space Force to be able to modernize and recapitalize. Because right now the Air Force is cannibalizing its combat fleet and has been for decades. We haven't seen any real new capability come into the service for quite some time.
Great points, Heather.
Gonzo here. There's 2 points. General Brown, his answer was 2 points he made. First, he said, quote, "The transition to the future Air Force must start today." And when you think about that, I think we would all agree with that. But there are things in the Air Force's budget that doesn't make sense. It doesn't show that, frankly, that transition is starting today. One, of course, is the decrease in actual procurement funding. Continuing the old practice of beefing up R&D and going to buy it in some theoretical future. Plus, we have acquisition of fourth generation F-15EXs, which makes no sense. The second thing he said is we must be willing to change to make the tough choices. I agree 100%. However, DoD as an organization is not making the tough choices. We continue to see this stovepipe budget manipulation service by service instead of the cross-service, cross-domain trade-offs that are going to be critical to maximizing DoD as a whole, its combat power in the future. And that's why we see redundant investments in long-range strike, a lack of investments in air and missile defenses to protect our forward bases, and so forth.
Yeah, let me just, I just want to highlight, and I know we've got so much to cover here, but, you know, the good senator's comment, quote, "China will have more stealth fighters than we will in the Western Pacific by 2025. I don't know how many people recognize that in the United States Air Force fighter force, only 20% of the force is stealth. 80% is non-stealth. We have to work hard to reverse that ratio.
It's also interesting how that figure has turned upside down. In 2009, then Secretary Robert Gates said that the reason we need to reduce our legacy fighters in the Air Force was because by 2020, the United States would have 1,200 stealth fighters and the Chinese would have 0. Well, that didn't turn out to be a very accurate crystal ball at that time.
Well, sticking with Senator Inhofe, he also dove right into the F-35 discussion.
And I hate to keep you comparing my fear for what might be happening to the F-35 with what has happened and did happen back in about 2004 with the F-22. We want to make sure that we profit from the mistakes we made back at that time. Mr. Kendall testified at his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of the Air Force that the way to bring down sustainment costs is to procure more F-35s. So, General Brown, I was surprised that no F-35s were on your unfunded priority list. I'd kind of like to know, first of all, I'm sure there's some reason that we did not have more on our unfunded list this time as we have in the past. And then some kind of a statement as to your commitment as to the F-35 being the cornerstone of the Air Force. Now, that's not just for us on this committee. That's for our allies that are out there because they're depending on that because there's not another game in town. Do you have any response as to why we didn't have unfunded F-35s in this last budget?
Yeah, let me jump in here. I know, Slick, you're going to ask folks for thoughts, so I'm not even going to let you ask the question. I'll just give them to you. The fact of the matter is that the Air Force is in a square corner. They have such a huge plate of recapitalization that they have to deal with. They're also challenged by the high sustainment costs of the F-35. However, people forget that sustainment cost is on a road to come down. The other fact that people forget is what we have hammered home over and over and over again, but folks inside the building and on the Hill, well, when you bring it up to them, they realize it's not intuitive, and that's cost per effect. If, in fact, the F-35 can accomplish a mission with a fraction of the number of aircraft that takes a fourth-generation aircraft to accomplish, guess what? It provides a much, much greater value. So we have to move toward an evaluation measure of merit known as cost per effect, and that'll get us to the right answers.
Yeah, I'll throw 2 quick points out. One of the things our national defense strategy is very, very clear on is a fight with China or a fight with Russia would not be like the wars that we fought in the past against much lesser militaries. Our military, our Air Force, our fighter force must be prepared to fight in contested operational environments from day one of the fight to day end. And that is not the force that we have on the ramp today. It's a high-low mix that is skewed toward the low end, and that is going to drive another cost, and that is high attrition rates that we simply do not have the aircraft to sustain, and we already have a pilot shortage. We certainly don't have the pilots to sustain that either.
Gonzo, as you're talking, it's not just a high-low mix, it's a new-old mix.
Yes.
And the old mix, the old portion of the mix is going to die when faced with a peer competitor.
Well, it's not even just a pure competitor. I mean, 5th generation is the cost of entry to the modern battle space. Just take a look at what happened in Syria. All they needed to do was roll an S-400 in the battle space, and suddenly you had to have 5th generation there. So it's absurd that we continue to talk about the need for F-35 or F-22 or 5th generation in terms of pure conflict, because the only thing we need to do, or the only thing the adversary needs to do, is place that kind of high-end surface-to-air defense site, and poof, it's suddenly turned into a pure type competition.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's also important to highlight that the conversation also focused on things like readiness, with Senator King highlighting some important numbers.
General Brown, I'm concerned about readiness and aircraft availability. There was a GAO report in the winter of 2020 that indicated various numbers for various airplanes, ranging from 70% down to 52%, sometimes in even the 40% range. How do we improve that? That just strikes me as unacceptable. I don't know the comparable figures for the private sector, but my sense is if Delta Airlines had a 70% availability for their aircraft, they'd be out of business.
Hey, this is it's such a tricky discussion, because obviously old aircraft take a lot of TLC to keep going, and too many mission areas are undersized and in high demand. And we've also been running on maintenance accounts way too thin and way too often. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Just a macro level thought. First, let's not get sucked into the misperception that the U.S. military ought to be run like a business. We're in the business of war, and we're in the business of winning. And so Delta Airlines doesn't have a requirement to penetrate contested airspace, deal with advanced surface-to-air missile systems, and deliver effective munitions against an adversary that's shooting at them. So we got to get rid of this comparison of airplanes that daily put 9 Gs on the jets and the pilots' bodies, in an airplane that if it flies over 1 G, the passengers go nuts. So I just lay that out there on top.
I think I wrote an op-ed back in January in Defense One that talked about the using mission capable rates and availability rates as the wrong way to gauge readiness. So I think this really applies. And in fact, General Brown and Joan Berger of the Marine Corps also wrote one several weeks after I did, talking about that. The defense reporters, members of Congress, the GAO, they all seize on mission capable rates. And, I contend that, mission capable rate is just one small slice of readiness factors. And it really was sort of brought to the forefront when Secretary Mattis put out a mission-capable 80% requirement that everybody disagreed with, and it only lasted a year because of that. So I think we really need to take a look at how we're measuring readiness. Mission-capable rate, aircraft availability rate, those are really lagging indicators that are used for fleet planning. They're really not accurate to talk about when you're going to be, because a good example of that is when the F-35s were deployed over in the Middle East, they were close to 100% mission capable rate all the time because they got parts priorities and those sorts of things. So let's come up with a really good way of measuring readiness that's more comprehensive and that has more meaning. And I agree with you, Dave, on the comparison to Delta. It's it's apples and oranges.
Yeah, mission capable rates are used for managing the force, of course. Well, let's assume through the power of our microphones we can make it 1.0. All those jets are mission capable. Guess what? You still will not have enough iron on the ramp to fight a single war, a war with China, a war with Russia, much less also defend the homeland, deter elsewhere, and all the other missions. And the other thing that's not taken into consideration for this force is attrition, which we've mentioned earlier. The Air Force's attrition rates, which they apply to how many jets they're going to buy, are based on peacetime attrition. Jets lost in the course of training and other activities, not what might be lost in a war with China. We have no attrition reserve in the force today.
And by the way, if you take a look at the macro level, there's an easy way to increase mission capable rates. Don't fly the airplanes. If you don't fly the airplanes, you're not training the pilots. And if you're not training the pilots, when it comes time to fight, you're going to lose them. So, there's a simple example of why the current MC rate calculation is, as Matt said, it's just one small piece of the equation. It's not all of it.
Well, the two pieces of this as well that sort of are the umbrella over the sustainment and mission capable rates is, again, not enough budget. So you're shortchanging your spares, you're shortchanging your supply, you're shortchanging your depots, you're shortchanging your maintainers, and then the other piece is just that these aircraft are too old. We're still flying a force that was primarily built in the 1980s during the Reagan defense buildup.
All right, well, moving on, Senator King also asked about the Air Force's ICBM force, which is currently slated for modernization through a program known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD for short.
Have you done a cost analysis of the new GBSD versus life extension for Minuteman III over a long period of time? Where does that, what's the difference in cost?
I just have a question here. Can someone give us some background on this debate? Because I don't understand why people are comparing extending the life of the current Minuteman III ICBM versus a new GBSD program. And I'd also like to hear what you think about General Brown's response.
Sure, you're right, Slick. It is an apples-oranges comparison, no question. Just a couple of numbers. The first missile is going to fly in calendar year 23, and we're going to hit initial operational capability in 29 and full operational capability with about 400 missiles in 2036. Now, the program itself, the recent cost analysis, the reason it came out last fall, was the GBSD will cost between 93 to 96 billion. That compares well with the 2016 analysis of alternatives assessment, about 1% growth, actually, according to General Brown. And in fact, compared to the Minuteman III, the latter, Minuteman III, will cost about $30 billion more over its life to extend that. But let's say the cost of the GBSD and the cost of Minuteman to extend the Minuteman III were equal. The latter will not meet requirements. It's a system designed in the 70s for a very, very, very different threat environment. We've been talking about old aircraft and the problems surviving in contested and highly contested environments. Same problem with the Minuteman III. It will not be survivable, and it is not going to be sustainable no matter how much money we dump into it.
Gonzo's point, I mean, it's, the Minuteman III was fielded in the early 70s, and it had a 10-year expected service life. So in some ways, the Air Force is a victim of its own success with the many life extension programs that they've done with that now. But, the bottom line is, as you say, it doesn't meet the requirement to be survivable.
Yeah, now here's a simple translation of all of that. An extension of Minuteman III is more expensive than building the new GBSD, period, end of discussion.
All right, well, with that, bombers also got some attention during the hearing, with Senator Rounds highlighting the recent B-1 retirements and the importance of the B-21.
The bomber inventory continues to be stressed in the retirement of 17 B-1Bs, while understandably necessary, depletes an already undersized and critical force. Are there any further planned cuts to the bomber force before adding significant numbers of operational B-21s to the inventory?
All right. Well, I know that there are some strong opinions on the size of the bomber inventory in this group, so open it up to the first one who wants to take a shot.
Oh, I'll take a shot being a B-52 pilot. Sorry, General Deptula.
Now, you might have been a pilot, but I'm still the Air Force's biggest advocate for bombers.
I'll agree that you're larger than I am.
Everyone in here knows that's not true. Go ahead, Gonzo.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to continue. I thought the answer was not clear on that one. I did not hear a no, we will not cut the bomber force further before we field significant numbers of operational B-21s. With the retirement of the 17 B-1s this fiscal year, we're going to be down to 140 total bombers. That's relative to 411 bombers that we fought Desert Storm with. But let's take that down to sorties. That equates to about 30 sorties per day, long-range strike sorties out of that bomber force at any given time, about 8 of which would be B-2 sorties. In Desert Storm, B-52s alone flew 50 sorties. So this is far below a one-war force, no question about it.
Yeah, listen, folks. The bottom line is, if you look at the attributes of the kinds of conflicts that we're talking about fighting or potentially fighting, not just in the Pacific, but in Eastern Europe, AOR as well, there are 2 critical attributes, actually 3, but it's payload, range, and penetrability. The B-21 is very promising in terms of delivering on all 3 of those. But now what we have to do is purchase them in the appropriate quantity. Now, it's a little bit early to determine end-game quantities, but we ought to be looking at a minimum of 180 B-21s.
Yeah, and the Air Force has officially said at least 225 future bomber forces. That would be all B-21s and keeping the remaining B-52s. And all the analyses and war games I participated on shows that the buy of the B-21s ought to be somewhere around 240 or even more. It's the penetrating strike capacity that our force lacks today.
All right. Well, Congressman Rogers highlighted the declining procurement budget in the Air Force's fiscal year 22 submission. Given that this was supposed to be a decade of procurement, it's obviously troubling.
The Air Force is slashing its procurement budget by more than 12% and divesting over 200 aircraft. They tell me this will produce $4.5 billion in so-called savings the Air Force says it needs to invest in modernization, except that's not what's actually happening. Only half of the $4.5 billion is invested in research and development of modernized systems.
All right, so I hear show me the money. Obviously, it comes a point where aircraft inventory simply cannot get smaller given the demand, and we're rolling the dice on a future buy. It's obviously high risk.
Yeah, well, this is, again, this whole subject reiterates the point that the Department of Defense in general and the United States Air Force and Department of the Air Force in particular is underfunded to meet the needs of the national defense strategy. And it is the responsibility of our leadership to articulate that. The problem is, as someone mentioned earlier, we continue to do budgeting in the stovepipes of individual services, as opposed to looking at cost per effect per investment across all the services. I mean, if a B-1 can deliver the same ordnance capacity as an entire carrier battle group in a day, why did we retire 17 carrier battle groups worth of capability out of the Air Force last year, and we didn't touch the carriers?
You know, I think the issue with this is magnified when you look at and I had mentioned this on the last rendezvous. We're just now entering that bow wave of nuclear enterprise recapitalization, and the department says that their nuclear mission is their number one priority, and the Air Force has 2 of the 3 legs of the triad. So in the Air Force's defense, they're trying to balance all these different things with the top line that they have. And, the bottom line is the top line is not large enough to be able to get after all these problems.
Right. And we're not going to put any boots on the ground on mainland China. So let's be candid, and it's time for some straight talk here in terms of resource investment across the different services. We need to invest in what takes time to develop. one can reconstitute a ground force very fast relative to what it takes to put together a modern long-range strike aircraft.
Well, I'm going to bring this back to this being the decade of procurement. We need to buy the things that we have in production now. So, I mean, largely for combat air forces, that means F-35 and B-21. Deferring procurement and investing in R&D, I'll tell you, the next PowerPoint, next generation is always going to be cheaper, easier, and on schedule, on budget, on time, right? I mean, but we all know that that's not true. We need to buy what we have now so we can retire legacy forces and transition to the future.
I'm going to back up something that General Deptula said. When you think about a fight in the Pacific with China, that is going to be an air, sea, space, cyberspace, domain dominant fight, not a boots on the ground fight. In Europe, slightly different case. It's going to be air, land, space, cyberspace, domain dominant. What's common to both those things? Air. And our Air Force is being funded for less than one theater, not the two of them.
Good point, Gonzo. I'd also throw in there space.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you've heard today, don't forget to hammer down on that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment for us to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like to hear more about. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Until next time, this is John Baum. Stay safe and check 6.